The laughter started before Lieutenant Camilla Restrepo even reached the bar. "What's Florence Nightingale doing in here?" Sergeant Knox muttered to his companion, loud enough for half the room to hear. "This is a combat zone, not a hospital ward." His friend chuckled and shook his head, already dismissing her presence with a wave of his hand. The brass monkey was sacred territory for operators. Steel beams crossed overhead like the ribs of some massive beast, and the walls displayed enough unit patches and combat photos to tell 1,000 war stories. Tonight, the air hung thick with cigar smoke and the kind of tension that came when warriors gathered to decompress after missions that never made it into official reports. Camilla moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her medical corps uniform drawing stares and whispered comments from every direction. "Think she's lost," someone behind her said, probably looking for the medical tent. The voice carried the particular brand of condescension reserved for support personnel who wandered into operator territory. Captain Torres leaned against the far wall, his Special Forces tab catching the dim light as he watched her approach the bartender. $20, says she orders something with an umbrella in it, he announced to his squad. These medical types always do. His men laughed, the sound cutting through the general buzz of conversation like a challenge thrown down. The bartender, a grizzled former Marine named Dutch, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. "You sure you're in the right place, Doc? This establishment caters to a particular clientele." His tone suggested she might be more comfortable somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere more appropriate for someone who carried bandages instead of bullets. Before we dive deeper into tonight's events, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar situations where someone was judged before their true capabilities were known. Camilla's response was steady, professional. "Bourbon. Neat. 2 fingers." The request silenced the immediate area around the bar, though the broader conversation continued to flow around them like water around stones. Dutch hesitated for a moment, clearly questioning whether someone in medical scrubs should be ordering drinks meant for hardened operators. Staff Sergeant Morrison approached from her left, his Ranger tab gleaming above a chest full of ribbons that told stories of deployments to places that didn't officially exist. "Ma'am, you might be more comfortable at the officers' club. This place can get pretty rough when the boys start sharing war stories." His suggestion carried the weight of someone who believed he was being helpful, protecting her from conversations she couldn't possibly understand. The dismissal in his voice was unmistakable. These men had seen combat, had faced enemy fire, had made life and death decisions in seconds. In their minds, she represented the safe rear echelon, the people who patched them up after real soldiers did the actual fighting. Her presence here felt like an intrusion into their brotherhood, a reminder of the support structure they needed but didn't necessarily respect. More voices joined the growing chorus of doubt. "Look at those hands," someone observed from a nearby table. "Clean fingernails, soft skin. Bet she's never held anything heavier than a stethoscope." The observation sparked nods of agreement from his companions, each of whom bore the calloused hands and permanent tan lines that marked them as field operators. Camilla accepted her bourbon from Dutch without comment, her movements calm and measured despite the increasing scrutiny. The liquid amber caught the light as she lifted it, and for a moment, the entire bar seemed to pause, waiting to see how the medical corps lieutenant would handle the attention. This wasn't her first rodeo, though none of these men could possibly know that. To them, she was just another support person, probably fresh out of training, definitely out of her element in a place where conversations revolve around kill counts and extraction zones. Their judgment was written across their faces as clearly as the unit patches on their uniforms. And tonight, that judgment was about to be tested in ways none of them could imagine. The bourbon burned exactly as it should, clean and sharp down her throat. Camilla set the glass down with deliberate precision. The sound of crystal meeting would barely audible above the growing murmur of conversation that seemed to center increasingly on her presence. Sergeant First Class Valdez nudged his companion and gestured toward her with his beer bottle. "Check out the medic trying to fit in. Probably thinks watching MASH reruns counts as combat experience." His laugh was harsh, the kind that carried edges sharp enough to cut. The men around his table joined in, their amusement building like a wave, gathering strength before breaking against the shore. From her position at the bar, Camilla could hear fragments of other conversations, each one adding another layer to the growing assessment of her worthiness to occupy space in their sanctuary. Medical Corps, someone said with obvious disdain, probably faints at the sight of blood that isn't coming from a training dummy. The comment drew chuckles from a group of Navy SEALs whose table displayed enough trident pins to outfit a small platoon. Major Blackwood approached from the far end of the bar, his stride carrying the confident swagger of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. His special operations patch caught the light as he moved, and the conversations around him quieted slightly out of automatic respect for rank and reputation. "Lieutenant," he said, his tone polite but condescending. "This is quite unusual. Medical personnel typically avoid establishments like this. Too much talk about the sharp end of military operations." His smile was practiced, the kind officers used when they believed they were being diplomatic while delivering dismissals. The implication hung in the air like smoke from Dutch's ever-present cigars. This was a place for operators, for people who understood the weight of weapons and the finality of trigger pulls. Medical personnel belonged in clean, sterile environments where the worst decisions involved dosage calculations and patient scheduling, not in places where conversations revolved around ballistics and body counts. Captain Vega leaned back in a chair at a nearby table, his green beret tilted at the precise angle that marked him as someone who had earned the right to wear it in places most people couldn't pronounce. "What's next?" he asked his companions loudly enough for half the bar to hear. "Are we going to start letting accountants and supply clerks in here too? Maybe they can share their war stories about inventory management and budget reconciliation." The laughter that followed was cruel, pointed, designed to make clear exactly where medical personnel ranked in the hierarchy of military respect. These men measured worth in terms of enemy contact and successful missions, not in lives saved or wounds healed. In their worldview, support personnel were necessary but fundamentally different, lacking the warrior spirit that defined true soldiers. Dutch refilled her glass without being asked, though his expression remained skeptical. "In 30 years of running this place," he said quietly, "I've seen maybe 3 medical types come through that door. 2 of them left immediately, and the third only stayed long enough to treat a bar fight injury." His observation carried the weight of institutional knowledge, the kind that comes from watching the same patterns repeat themselves year after year. The assessment was clear. Medical personnel didn't belong here because they couldn't handle the reality of what operators discussed when they thought civilians weren't listening. They lacked the psychological fortitude necessary to process stories about close-quarters combat, and the moral flexibility required to understand that sometimes good people had to do terrible things in service of larger objectives. Sergeant Thompson gestured toward her with his pool cue, pausing his game to address his opponent. "See that uniform. Clean pressed, all the creases in the right places. Bet she irons it every morning and has never had to worry about washing blood out of the fabric." His observations sparked nods of agreement from the growing audience that seemed increasingly focused on cataloging everything that marked her as fundamentally different from them. The judgment was becoming more specific, more detailed, more personal. These weren't just casual dismissals anymore, but systematic assessments of her qualifications to occupy their space. Every detail of her appearance, from her polished shoes to her regulation haircut, was being interpreted as evidence of her separation from the combat arms community they represented. Camilla finished her second bourbon with the same measured calm she had shown with the first, her movements betraying nothing of the calculations running through her mind. The bar continued to fill with operators rotating back from missions, each new arrival adding to the collective assessment that she represented an intrusion into their professional sanctuary, a reminder of the soft support structure that kept their hard edges functional. The evening crowd thickened as more teams filtered in from the field, their gear still bearing the dust and sweat of operations that would never appear in morning briefings. Each new arrival seemed to pause at the threshold, their eyes inevitably finding Camila at the bar and their expressions shifting to match the growing consensus that her presence represented some kind of category error. Colonel Martinez entered with his usual entourage of senior NCOs, men whose combined service records read like a history of modern warfare. His eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency before settling on the unusual sight of medical corps insignia reflecting the dim lighting above the bourbon bottles. "Interesting evening we're having, Dutch," he said, approaching the bar with measured steps. "Not often we see medical personnel sampling the local atmosphere." His tone carried the diplomatic weight of senior command, but underneath lay the same fundamental question that had been circulating since her arrival. What exactly was a medic doing in operator territory? The colonel's attention brought a new level of scrutiny to the situation. When senior leadership noticed anomalies, explanations became necessary, and explanations in environments like this typically resulted in people being relocated to more appropriate venues. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Medical personnel had their place, and this wasn't it. Master Sergeant Rodriguez detached himself from his usual corner table, where Delta Force operators gathered to discuss the kind of missions that required congressional oversight and executive approval. His approach carried the casual confidence of someone who had operated in 37 countries under circumstances that legally never happened. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the immediate area, "you might want to consider relocating before the evening gets more interesting. Things tend to get complicated when operators start comparing kill counts and discussing techniques that aren't covered in Geneva Convention training." His suggestion sounded helpful, but carried the unmistakable implication that she lacked the psychological preparation for authentic military conversation. The assessment was becoming more pointed, more specific about exactly why medical personnel were considered fundamentally different from combat arms. These men dealt with the sharp end of military operations, the places where policy became personal and where split-second decisions determined who went home and who didn't. Medical personnel dealt with the aftermath, the cleanup, the sanitized version of warfare that arrived at aid stations already filtered through triage protocols. Captain Shin approached from the dartboard area, where Air Force Special Operations personnel had been engaged in competition that involved throwing weighted objects at precise targets while maintaining conversations about precision bombing runs and high-altitude infiltration techniques. "Lieutenant," he said, his flight suit still bearing the oil stains that marked recent helicopter operations, "this establishment caters to a very specific community. People who understand that sometimes the mission requires making choices that medical ethics boards would find problematic." His explanation carried the patient tone of someone educating a civilian about military realities they couldn't possibly comprehend. The distinction was becoming clearer with each interaction. These men operated in moral gray areas where traditional medical principles like first do no harm became complicated by operational necessities. They belonged to a community that understood when violence was not only acceptable but required, while medical personnel belonged to a community dedicated to healing and preservation of life regardless of circumstances. Sergeant Major Williams emerged from the back room, where senior enlisted personnel gathered to discuss the kind of operational details that never appeared in official after-action reports. His presence commanded immediate attention from everyone within visual range, the kind of automatic respect that came from decades of successful missions under impossible conditions. "Doc," he said, using the universal military term for medical personnel, "you sure you understand what kind of place this is? We don't talk about saving lives here. We talk about taking them efficiently and under circumstances that require particular psychological preparation." His assessment was direct, uncompromising, designed to clarify exactly where the lines were drawn between their communities. The message was unmistakable. This was sacred ground for warriors, for people who had crossed moral boundaries that medical personnel were trained to respect and preserve. Her presence represented a fundamental category confusion, like bringing a priest to a weapons demonstration or inviting a pacifist to a tactical planning session. Camila ordered her third bourbon, her movements remaining steady despite the increasing pressure of collective scrutiny. The glass felt familiar in her hands, the weight and balance as natural as breathing, though none of the assembled operators could possibly know why someone trained in medical procedures would be comfortable with the kind of establishment that specialized in serving people who killed for their country. The conversations around her shifted into more explicit territory as the evening progressed, each story designed to establish the psychological distance between those who took lives and those who saved them. Captain Brennan began recounting a mission in Kandahar where his team had eliminated 17 targets in a single night operation, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing routine maintenance procedures. "Look at her face," Sergeant Knox observed loudly, gesturing toward Camila with his beer bottle. Probably never heard anyone discuss actual combat operations before. Medical personnel get the sanitized version, the cleaned-up reports that don't mention what it actually looks like when high-velocity rounds meet human targets. His assessment drew nods from surrounding tables, where similar conversations were establishing the professional boundaries that separated operators from support personnel. The stories became more detailed, more graphic, more specifically designed to test whether civilian sensibilities could handle military realities. Major Sutton described close-quarters combat in urban environments where collateral damage calculations had to be made in seconds, where the difference between acceptable losses and war crimes came down to tactical decisions made under pressure that medical personnel would never face. Staff Sergeant Harrison leaned against the bar next to her, his Ranger tab catching the light as he signaled Dutch for another round. "Ma'am," he said conversationally, "you ever been in a firefight where friendly fire becomes a real possibility? Where you have to make split-second decisions about whether the person in your crosshairs is enemy combatant or civilian?" His question was designed to highlight exactly why medical personnel didn't belong in discussions about operational realities. The psychological testing was becoming more systematic, more pointed about the fundamental differences between communities that preserved life and communities that ended it professionally. These men operated under rules of engagement that required them to make moral calculations that medical training specifically prohibited, decisions that would violate every principle of medical ethics but were necessary for mission success. Colonel Reyes approached from the pool table area where Marine Force Recon personnel had been discussing amphibious assault techniques that involved acceptable casualty rates and strategic target prioritization. His presence brought additional weight to the growing assessment of her qualifications to remain in their professional sanctuary. "Lieutenant," he said formally, medical corps personnel typically find these conversations disturbing. "We discuss operational necessities that conflict with medical principles about preserving human life regardless of circumstances. Perhaps you would be more comfortable in an environment where conversations focus on healing rather than tactical elimination." His suggestion carried the diplomatic courtesy of senior leadership, but made clear the fundamental incompatibility between her training and their reality. The distinction was becoming sharper with each interaction. Medical personnel were trained to save everyone, to treat enemy combatants with the same care as friendly forces, to prioritize life preservation above all other considerations. Operators were trained to eliminate targets efficiently, to prioritize mission success over individual survival, to make tactical decisions that medical ethics would classify as murders under different circumstances. Chief Petty Officer Davidson emerged from the corner where Navy SEAL teams gathered to discuss maritime infiltration techniques and underwater demolition procedures that required particular psychological preparation for close-quarters killing. His approach carried the casual authority of someone who had operated in 43 countries under circumstances that never appeared in official documentation. "Doc," he said, using the universal military designation for medical personnel, "you understand what we do here. We don't save lives. We end them under orders and circumstances that require specific mental conditioning. Medical personnel deal with the aftermath, but they don't participate in the operational decisions that create casualties in the first place. His explanation was educational, designed to clarify the professional boundaries that separated their communities. The message was becoming unmistakable. This establishment existed for people who killed professionally, who understood the weight of taking human life under tactical circumstances, who could process the moral complexity of violence in service of strategic objectives. Medical personnel belonged to a different community entirely, one dedicated to healing and preservation regardless of political or tactical considerations. Captain Foster interrupted his conversation about urban warfare techniques to address the growing situation at the bar. "That uniform represents everything we're trained to protect," he announced to his table companions. "Medical personnel save lives. We take them. Different skill sets, different psychological requirements, different moral frameworks entirely." His analysis drew agreement from the assembled operators, each of whom understood the fundamental incompatibility between medical ethics and operational necessities. The atmosphere in the Brass Monkey had shifted into something more intense, more deliberately challenging. Word had spread through the evening crowd that Medical Corps personnel was attempting to integrate into operator territory, and the response was becoming increasingly coordinated. Tables of special forces, Rangers, SEALs, and Delta operators were beginning to coalesce around a shared mission, establishing exactly why support personnel didn't belong in their professional sanctuary. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes entered with his typical commanding presence, followed by a group of senior operators whose combined experience represented decades of classified missions across 6 continents. His eyes found Camila immediately, and his expression showed the kind of disapproval typically reserved for security breaches and protocol violations. "Gentlemen," he announced loud enough for the entire establishment to hear, "it appears we have a civilian observer tonight. Someone who believes medical training qualifies them to understand operational realities." His statement drew immediate attention from every corner of the bar, conversations pausing as operators focused on the developing situation. The designation was deliberate and cutting. By calling her a civilian observer, the lieutenant colonel was stripping away her military status and reducing her to someone who watched real soldiers work, someone who existed on the periphery of actual military operations. The message was clear. Medical personnel were observers, not participants, in the business of warfare. Sergeant Major Thompson approached from the weapons display area, where senior enlisted personnel had been discussing close-quarters combat techniques that required particular psychological conditioning. His movement attracted followers, creating a growing semicircle of operators whose collective attention focused on the anomalous presence at the bar. "Ma'am," he said formally, "this establishment serves personnel who kill for their country under circumstances that require specific mental preparation. Medical personnel save lives regardless of political affiliation or tactical necessity. Fundamentally different mission sets that require incompatible psychological frameworks." His explanation was comprehensive, designed to establish the unbridgeable gap between their professional communities. The analysis was becoming more sophisticated, more systematic about exactly why medical and combat personnel operated in separate spheres. These men understood that successful operators required the ability to dehumanize targets, to process violence as routine, to make tactical decisions that prioritized mission success over individual survival. Medical personnel were trained for exactly the opposite psychological framework. Captain Morrison began recounting a mission in Somalia where his team had been forced to eliminate medical personnel who were treating enemy combatants, his voice carrying the detached professionalism of someone describing necessary tactical decisions. The story was specifically chosen to highlight the fundamental incompatibility between medical ethics and operational requirements. "See how she's handling that story," Staff Sergeant Williams observed to his companions. Medical personnel aren't psychologically prepared for the realities of tactical operations, where preserving enemy lives becomes counter to mission objectives. They lacked the mental conditioning necessary to process operational necessities that conflict with medical principles. His assessment drew nod from surrounding operators who understood exactly what psychological preparation warfare required. The testing was becoming more pointed, more specifically designed to demonstrate why medical personnel couldn't function in operator environments. These stories weren't just war tales shared among professionals. They were deliberate psychological challenges designed to expose the fundamental differences between communities trained to preserve life and communities trained to end it efficiently. Major Rodriguez gestured toward her with his whiskey glass, addressing the growing crowd of observers. Medical Corps personnel deal with the clean version of warfare, the aftermath that arrives at aid stations already filtered through triage protocols. They don't participate in the tactical decisions that create casualties in the first place. Different skill sets, different psychological requirements, completely different moral frameworks. His analysis was educational, designed to clarify the professional boundaries that separated their communities. Chief Warrant Officer Davis approached from the intelligence corner, where operators discussed reconnaissance missions that involved surveillance of civilian populations and target identification procedures that required particular moral flexibility. His movement brought additional authority to the growing consensus about her inappropriate presence. "Doc," he said conversationally, "you understand that we discuss operational techniques that medical ethics would classify as war crimes under different circumstances. Target selection, collateral damage calculations, tactical decisions that prioritize mission success over individual survival. Medical personnel aren't trained to process these realities because their entire professional framework is built around preserving life regardless of tactical considerations." The message was becoming unmistakable. This wasn't just about professional separation. It was about fundamental psychological incompatibility between communities that approach human life from completely opposite perspectives. Medical personnel preserved, operators eliminated. Medical personnel healed, operators destroyed. The frameworks were not just different, but actively contradictory. The crowd had grown thicker, more deliberately focused. What had begun as casual observation had evolved into something resembling a professional assessment, with operators from different units coordinating their efforts to establish exactly why medical personnel represented a fundamental category error in their sacred space. General Patterson entered through the main entrance, his 4 stars catching the overhead lighting like beacons of ultimate authority. The conversations didn't stop, but they shifted into lower registers as every operator in the establishment registered the presence of someone whose decisions shaped theater-level strategy and continental defense priorities. "Interesting evening, Dutch," the general said, approaching the bar with measured steps that commanded immediate attention from everyone within visual range. "Not often we see medical corps personnel sampling the local culture." His observation carried the weight of someone accustomed to having his casual comments analyzed for policy implications by entire intelligence communities. The general's attention brought a new dimension to the situation. When 4-star leadership noticed anomalies, explanations became necessary at levels that could affect careers and unit assignments. The message was implicit but unmistakable. Medical personnel who insisted on occupying operator territory might find their assignments reconsidered by people with the authority to relocate them permanently. Colonel Stevens detached himself from the strategic planning corner, where senior officers discussed operational requirements that involved acceptable casualty rates and target prioritization across multiple theaters of operation. His approach brought additional command authority to the growing consensus that her presence represented some kind of professional boundary violation. "General," he said formally, "medical personnel typically avoid environments where conversations focus on tactical elimination rather than life preservation. Different training, different psychological preparation, different ethical frameworks entirely." His explanation was designed to clarify the professional boundaries that separated their communities for someone whose decisions shaped military policy at the highest levels. The assessment was becoming more sophisticated, more focused on the systemic reasons why medical and combat personnel operated in separate professional spheres. These weren't just cultural preferences, but fundamental incompatibilities built into military structure itself. Medical personnel were trained to preserve life regardless of political or tactical considerations. Operators were trained to eliminate targets efficiently under circumstances that required specific psychological conditioning. Sergeant Major Jackson emerged from the counterterrorism section, where senior enlisted personnel discussed urban warfare techniques that involved civilian population management and target identification procedures that required particular moral flexibility. His movement attracted followers from across the establishment, creating a growing audience of professional observers. "Ma'am," he said conversationally, "this establishment serves personnel who make tactical decisions that medical ethics boards would classify as murders under civilian circumstances. Target elimination, collateral damage acceptance, strategic violence in service of political objectives." Medical personnel aren't psychologically prepared for these discussions because their entire professional framework prohibits the kind of moral calculations we perform routinely. His explanation was comprehensive, designed to establish the unbridgeable psychological gap between their communities. The distinction was becoming clearer with each interaction. Medical personnel saved everyone, treated enemy combatants with the same care as friendly forces, prioritized life preservation above tactical considerations. Operators eliminated specific targets, calculated acceptable losses, prioritized mission success over individual survival. The frameworks weren't just different, they were actively contradictory. Captain Vasquez began describing a mission in Afghanistan where his team had been forced to eliminate medical personnel who were providing aid to high-value targets, his voice carrying the detached professionalism of someone recounting necessary tactical decisions. The story was specifically chosen to highlight the fundamental incompatibility between medical principles and operational requirements. "Watch her reaction," Staff Sergeant Coleman observed to his companions. Medical personnel can't process operational realities where preserving enemy lives becomes counter to mission objectives. They lack the psychological conditioning necessary to understand why tactical decisions sometimes require violating medical principles. Different mental preparation, different moral frameworks, completely different professional communities. His assessment drew nods from surrounding operators who understood exactly what kind of psychological preparation successful warfare required. Major Henderson gestured toward her with his bourbon glass, addressing the growing crowd of observers whose attention had shifted from casual conversation to professional evaluation. "Medical Corps represents everything we're trained to protect, but they can't participate in the operational decisions that make protection possible. They heal, we eliminate. They preserve, we destroy. Fundamentally incompatible mission sets that require opposite psychological frameworks." His analysis was educational, designed to clarify the structural reasons why their communities remained professionally separated. The establishment had transformed into something resembling a professional tribunal, with operators from every branch of special operations forming concentric circles around the bar, where Camila maintained her position with unshakable composure. The collective assessment had moved beyond casual observation into systematic evaluation of her qualifications to occupy their sacred ground. Admiral Cortez entered through the side entrance, his Navy SEAL trident gleaming above ribbons that represented operations in theaters where American involvement was never officially acknowledged. His presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the establishment, conversations shifting into respectful acknowledgement of someone whose decisions shaped maritime special operations across 3 oceans. "Lieutenant," the Admiral said, approaching her position with measured authority. "Medical personnel typically find our conversations problematic. We discuss operational techniques that conflict with medical ethics, target elimination procedures that require specific psychological conditioning, tactical decisions that prioritize mission success over individual preservation. His observation carried the weight of someone accustomed to making strategic decisions that affected global security architectures. The Admiral's assessment brought new dimensions to the systematic evaluation. When flag-level leadership questioned someone's presence in operator territory, the implications extended beyond immediate social dynamics into potential career consequences and security clearance reviews. The message was clear. Medical personnel who insisted on occupying special operations space might find their professional trajectories reconsidered by people with authority to affect them permanently. Colonel Martinez began recounting a mission in Yemen where his team had been forced to eliminate an entire medical facility because enemy combatants were using it for command and control operations, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing necessary tactical decisions. The story was specifically chosen to demonstrate exactly why medical principles and operational requirements represented fundamentally incompatible frameworks. "Look at how she's processing that information," Chief Petty Officer Williams observed to his companions. Medical personnel aren't psychologically prepared to understand why tactical necessities sometimes require violating Geneva Convention protections for medical facilities. They can't make the moral calculations that operational success requires because their entire professional framework prohibits that kind of strategic thinking. His analysis drew agreement from surrounding operators who understood the psychological conditioning that effective warfare demanded. The testing had evolved into something more sophisticated, more deliberately designed to expose the fundamental incompatibilities between medical ethics and operational realities. These weren't just war stories shared among professionals. They were specific challenges designed to demonstrate why support personnel couldn't function in environments where strategic violence was discussed as routine professional methodology. Sergeant Major Rodriguez gestured toward her with his whiskey glass, addressing the growing audience of professional observers whose evaluation had become increasingly coordinated. Medical Corps personnel deal with the sanitized aftermath of tactical operations, casualties that arrive at aid stations already filtered through triage protocols and tactical decision matrices. They don't participate in the operational planning that creates those casualties in the first place, because medical training specifically prohibits the kind of moral flexibility that strategic violence requires. The distinction was becoming more precise with each interaction. Medical personnel were trained to heal everyone regardless of political affiliation or tactical necessity. Operators were trained to eliminate specific targets under circumstances that required particular psychological preparation. The frameworks weren't just different, but represented opposite approaches to human life itself. Captain Thompson approached from the psychological operations corner, where specialists discuss population manipulation techniques and information warfare strategies that required specific moral conditioning. His movement brought additional expertise to the growing consensus about her inappropriate presence in operator territory. "Ma'am," he said conversationally, "this establishment serves personnel who understand that sometimes preserving democracy requires tactical decisions that democratic principles would prohibit under different circumstances. Target elimination, population control, strategic deception in service of national objectives. Medical personnel can't process these realities because their professional framework is built around preserving life and promoting healing regardless of strategic considerations." General Harrison emerged from the strategic planning area, where senior officers discussed continental defense priorities and threat elimination procedures that involved acceptable casualty calculations across multiple theaters of operation. His approach brought ultimate command authority to the systematic evaluation of her qualifications to remain in their professional sanctuary. "Lieutenant," he said formally, "Medical Corps personnel represent everything our operations are designed to protect, but they cannot participate in the tactical decisions that make protection possible. Different training, different psychological preparation, fundamentally different ethical frameworks that approach human life from opposite perspectives." His assessment was comprehensive, designed to establish the structural reasons why medical and combat personnel operated in completely separate professional spheres that rarely intersected except under carefully controlled circumstances. The brass monkey had reached capacity, with operators standing shoulder to shoulder in a formation that resembled a briefing amphitheater more than a casual drinking establishment. Word had spread through secure communication channels that medical corps personnel was attempting to integrate into the most exclusive operator sanctuary in the theater, and the response had become systematic, coordinated, almost ceremonial in its precision. Secretary of Defense Morrison entered through the main entrance, his civilian suit doing nothing to diminish the immediate recognition of ultimate military authority. Conversations didn't pause, they stopped entirely. Every operator in the establishment understood that when cabinet-level leadership appeared in their sacred space, the evening had moved beyond social interaction into something approaching official policy evaluation. Interesting situation we have developing here, Dutch, the secretary said, approaching the bar with steps that seemed to measure the distance between civilian oversight and military operational reality. Medical personnel attempting to integrate into special operations culture represents a fascinating case study in professional boundary management. His observation carried implications that extended far beyond immediate social dynamics into potential policy reviews and operational doctrine reassessment. The Secretary's presence transformed the systematic evaluation into something resembling a formal review board, with operators from every special operations unit represented in what had become an impromptu assessment of professional boundaries and community integration policies. The stakes had escalated beyond individual career implications into potential changes in military structure itself. General Patterson approached from the strategic planning corner, where Joint Chiefs representatives had been discussing theater-level operations that involved acceptable casualty rates across multiple continents. His movement brought additional authority to what had become a comprehensive evaluation of medical personnel qualifications to occupy special operations territory. Mr. Secretary, he said formally, medical corps personnel typically avoid environments where conversations focus on strategic violence and tactical elimination because their professional framework specifically prohibits the kind of moral calculations that operational success requires. Different training methodologies, different psychological conditioning, fundamentally incompatible ethical systems that approach human life from opposite perspectives. His explanation was designed to clarify the structural reasons why medical and combat communities maintain strict professional separation. Colonel Ramirez began describing a classified operation where his team had been forced to eliminate an entire hospital staff because enemy combatants were using medical facilities for weapons storage and command operations, his voice carrying the detached professionalism of someone recounting necessary strategic decisions. The story was specifically chosen to demonstrate why medical ethics and operational requirements represented irreconcilable frameworks. Observe her psychological processing, Sergeant Major Davis commented to his companions. Medical personnel cannot comprehend operational realities where preserving enemy medical capabilities becomes counter to strategic objectives. They lack the mental conditioning necessary to understand why tactical success sometimes requires violating international humanitarian law protections. Different moral frameworks, completely incompatible professional communities. His assessment drew nods from surrounding operators who understood the psychological preparation that effective strategic violence required. The testing had evolved into something approaching a formal psychological evaluation, with senior leadership from every branch of special operations coordinating their efforts to establish definitive proof that medical personnel could not function in environments where strategic elimination was discussed as routine professional methodology. Admiral Foster gestured toward her with his bourbon glass, addressing the packed establishment whose attention had focused entirely on the developing evaluation. Medical Corps represents the humanitarian ideals that our operations are designed to protect, but they cannot participate in the tactical decisions that make protection possible because their entire professional identity is built around preserving life regardless of strategic necessity or tactical advantage. His analysis was comprehensive, designed to establish the fundamental incompatibility between medical preservation and operational elimination. Chief of Staff Williams emerged from the intelligence corner, where senior officers discussed continental defense strategies that involve population management and threat elimination across multiple theaters of operation. His approach brought ultimate strategic authority to the systematic assessment of her qualifications to remain in their professional sanctuary. "Lieutenant," he said conversationally, "this establishment serves personnel who understand that sometimes protecting democratic values requires tactical decisions that democratic principles would prohibit under civilian circumstances. Strategic elimination, acceptable casualty calculations, operational violence in service of national security objectives. Medical personnel cannot process these realities because their professional framework specifically prohibits the kind of moral flexibility that global security requires." The crowd had become something resembling a joint operations briefing, with representatives from every special operations community coordinating their assessment of whether medical personnel possessed the psychological conditioning necessary to function in environments where strategic violence was planned and executed as routine professional responsibility. The atmosphere had reached a crescendo of professional scrutiny that bordered on the surreal. Every chair, every standing position, every available space in the brass monkey was occupied by operators whose combined experience represented the entirety of American special operations capability. The systematic evaluation had evolved into something approaching a formal tribunal, with senior leadership from every branch coordinating their assessment of medical personnel integration into operator culture. Director of National Intelligence Crawford entered through the secure entrance, flanked by personnel whose presence indicated that the evening had attracted attention from intelligence communities that operated above traditional military command structures. His arrival transformed what had been military assessment into something approaching national security policy review. "Fascinating development we're witnessing tonight," the director observed, his voice carrying across the packed establishment with authority that transcended military rank into civilian oversight of strategic operations. Medical personnel attempting to integrate into special operations culture raises interesting questions about professional boundary management and psychological compatibility assessment protocols. His statement carried implications that extended beyond immediate social dynamics into potential intelligence community policy reviews. The director's presence brought new dimensions to the systematic evaluation, with operators understanding that when intelligence leadership noticed anomalies in special operations culture, the consequences could affect operational assignments and security clearance reviews across multiple agencies. The message was clear. Medical personnel who insisted on occupying intelligence community territory might find their careers reconsidered by people with authority to affect them at levels beyond traditional military structure. General Morrison approached from the Joint Operations Corner, where chairman-level personnel had been discussing strategic objectives that involved acceptable casualty calculations across multiple theaters and continental defense priorities. His movement brought ultimate military authority to what had become a comprehensive assessment of professional boundaries and community integration policies. "Mr. Director," he said formally, "Medical Corps personnel typically cannot process operational discussions that involve strategic elimination and tactical violence because their professional framework specifically prohibits the moral calculations that national security requires. Different psychological conditioning, fundamentally incompatible ethical systems that approach human preservation from opposite strategic perspectives." His explanation was designed to clarify the structural reasons why medical and intelligence communities maintained absolute professional separation. Colonel Henderson began describing a joint operation where medical facilities had been systematically eliminated because enemy combatants were using humanitarian protections for strategic advantage, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting necessary policy decisions. The story was specifically chosen to demonstrate why medical ethics and intelligence requirements represented irreconcilable operational frameworks. Monitor her psychological responses, Chief Warrant Officer Thompson commented to his companions. Medical personnel cannot comprehend strategic realities where preserving enemy medical capabilities becomes counter to national security objectives. They lack the mental preparation necessary to understand why operational success sometimes requires systematic violation of international humanitarian protections. Different moral conditioning, completely incompatible professional communities that serve opposite strategic functions. His assessment drew agreement from surrounding operators who understood the psychological frameworks that effective intelligence operations required. The evaluation had transformed into something approaching a formal psychological assessment, with leadership from every intelligence agency coordinating their efforts to establish definitive proof that medical personnel could not function in environments where strategic elimination was planned and executed as routine professional methodology under national security protocols. Admiral Patterson gestured toward her with his whiskey glass, addressing the packed establishment, whose attention had become entirely focused on the developing evaluation of professional boundaries and psychological compatibility. Medical Corps represents the humanitarian principles that our operations are designed to protect, but they cannot participate in the strategic decisions that make protection possible because their entire professional identity conflicts with the moral flexibility that global security architecture requires. His analysis was comprehensive, designed to establish the fundamental incompatibility between medical preservation and intelligence elimination. The crowd had evolved into something resembling a joint intelligence briefing, with representatives from every special operations and intelligence community coordinating their systematic assessment of whether medical personnel possessed the psychological conditioning necessary to function in environments where strategic violence was planned as routine national security methodology under circumstances that required specific moral preparation and operational flexibility. That medical training, specifically prohibited through ethical frameworks designed to preserve rather than eliminate human life regardless of strategic necessity or tactical advantage in service of national objectives. The moment had arrived when systematic evaluation would transition into definitive conclusion. Every senior leader, every operator, every representative of American special operations and intelligence capability stood in formation around the bar, where Camila maintained her position with composure that had remained unshakable throughout hours of escalating professional scrutiny and psychological testing. President's Chief of Staff Williams entered through the executive entrance, his presence indicating that the evening had attracted attention from the highest levels of national command authority. The conversations didn't pause or stop. They ceased to exist entirely as every person in the establishment recognized that civilian executive oversight had arrived to witness the resolution of what had become a formal assessment of professional boundaries and psychological compatibility. Remarkable situation developing here tonight, the Chief of Staff observed, his voice carrying across the silent establishment with authority that transcended every level of military and intelligence hierarchy. Medical personnel attempting to integrate into the most classified levels of special operations culture represents a unique case study in professional boundary management and psychological compatibility assessment that has implications for national security policy and operational doctrine. His statement transformed the evening from professional evaluation into potential executive policy review. The Chief of Staff's presence brought ultimate authority to what had become a comprehensive tribunal, with operators understanding that when executive branch leadership witnessed anomalies in special operations culture, the consequences could reshape military structure and intelligence community policies at the highest levels of government. The stakes had escalated beyond individual careers into potential changes in national security architecture itself. General Crawford approached from the Joint Chiefs Corner, where ultimate military authority had been observing the systematic evaluation with increasing interest in its implications for professional boundary management and psychological compatibility assessment protocols across multiple intelligence agencies and special operations communities. His movement brought definitive command authority to the final phase of what had become a formal review. "Mr. Chief of Staff," he said with ultimate formality, "Medical Corps personnel have demonstrated throughout this evening that they cannot process operational discussions involving strategic elimination because their professional framework specifically prohibits the moral calculations that national security architecture requires at the highest levels of classification and operational authority." His assessment was designed to provide executive leadership with definitive conclusions about medical personnel psychological incompatibility with intelligence community operations. The systematic evaluation had reached its culmination, with every level of American national security hierarchy represented in coordinated assessment of whether medical personnel possessed the psychological conditioning necessary to function in environments where strategic violence was planned and executed as routine methodology under executive authority and congressional oversight protocols that required specific moral flexibility. Director Morrison gestured toward her with his bourbon glass, addressing the packed establishment, whose collective attention had become entirely focused on providing executive leadership with definitive proof of medical personnel incompatibility with special operations culture and intelligence community requirements. Medical Corps represents humanitarian principles that our operations protect, but they cannot participate in strategic decisions that require systematic violation of those same principles because their professional identity specifically conflicts with the moral flexibility that global security architecture demands from personnel with ultimate classification access. The silence was absolute, complete, pregnant with the weight of final judgment about to be rendered by the highest levels of national command authority based on systematic evaluation conducted by every representative of American special operations and intelligence capability. The moment had arrived when definitive conclusions would be established about medical personnel psychological qualifications for integration into operator culture. Secretary Williams approached her position at the bar, his movement carrying the authority of someone prepared to deliver executive branch conclusions about professional boundaries and psychological compatibility based on comprehensive assessment conducted by ultimate military and intelligence leadership. The establishment held its collective breath, understanding that history was about to be made in the resolution of whether medical personnel could function in special operations territory. The Chief of Staff prepared to speak, his words carrying the weight of executive authority and national security policy implications, when something unexpected occurred that would transform every assumption, every evaluation, every systematic assessment that had been conducted throughout the evening by the assembled representatives of American special operations and intelligence community leadership. The Chief of Staff opened his mouth to deliver what would have been the definitive executive assessment of medical personnel psychological incompatibility with special operations culture, when Camila set down her bourbon glass with the same deliberate precision she had maintained throughout the evening. The crystal met wood with a sound that seemed to echo through the absolute silence like a starting pistol. She turned slowly, her movement carrying a fluidity that suddenly seemed less like medical corps training and more like something else entirely. Her eyes swept across the packed establishment, taking in every face, every rank, every representative of American special operations and intelligence capability who had spent the evening systematically evaluating her qualifications to occupy their sacred territory. The assessment was about to be reversed in ways that none of them could possibly anticipate. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent establishment with authority that seemed to emerge from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The tone was different now, stripped of the passive acceptance that had characterized her responses throughout hours of escalating scrutiny. Something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of pressure of the room. Her hand moved to the collar of her medical corps uniform, fingers finding a small tab that had been invisible beneath the regulation fabric. The movement was practiced, automatic, the kind of muscle memory that came from years of operational conditioning under circumstances that required specific psychological preparation and tactical flexibility. The tab pulled away, revealing something that transformed every assumption, every evaluation, every systematic assessment that had been conducted by the assembled leadership. Beneath the medical corps insignia lay another patch, one that had been concealed by careful uniform modification and operational security protocols designed to maintain cover identity under the most intensive scrutiny. The silence deepened impossibly as recognition began to dawn across faces that had spent decades learning to identify the most classified insignia in American military and intelligence hierarchy. The patch was small, understated, almost invisible unless someone knew exactly what to look for and possessed the security clearance necessary to understand its implications. She reached into her pocket with the same deliberate precision, extracting a small leather folder that she placed on the bar with movements that suddenly seemed less like medical training and more like operational conditioning acquired under circumstances that required specific psychological preparation for strategic violence and tactical elimination. The folder opened to reveal credentials that transformed the evening from professional evaluation into something approaching national security briefing. The identification was black, unmarked except for classification levels that extended beyond traditional military and intelligence hierarchy into operational authorities that few people in the establishment possessed clearance to acknowledge. Director Crawford's expression shifted from curious observation to something resembling professional recognition as he processed information that was reshaping his understanding of the evening's events. The systematic evaluation had been conducted under false premises, with leadership from every intelligence agency assessing someone whose actual qualifications were classified above their collective security clearance levels. General Morrison's face went through a series of calculations as he began to understand that the medical corps uniform had been operational cover for someone whose true identity was compartmentalized beyond traditional special operations and intelligence community access protocols. The evening's assessment had been comprehensive and systematic, but it had been evaluating the wrong person entirely. The Chief of Staff's preparation to deliver executive conclusions about medical personnel psychological incompatibility was interrupted by recognition that the situation had fundamentally changed in ways that transformed every assumption about professional boundaries and psychological compatibility assessment. The person they had been evaluating was not medical corps personnel attempting to integrate into operator culture. She was something else entirely. Admiral Patterson's bourbon glass paused halfway to his lips as understanding began to dawn that the systematic evaluation had been conducted under circumstances that none of them had anticipated. The medical corps uniform had been perfect operational cover, so convincing that even ultimate military and intelligence leadership had accepted it without question throughout hours of professional scrutiny. The moment had arrived when every evaluation, every assessment, every systematic conclusion about medical personnel, psychological incompatibility with special operations culture was about to be revealed as having been conducted under completely false premises that would transform the evening from professional boundary assessment into operational security demonstration. Camila leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the brass monkey. Every word carried with crystalline clarity to every corner of the establishment. The sound seemed to cut through the atmosphere of pressure like a blade through silk. Viper 1. The two words hung in the air for exactly 3 heartbeats before recognition hit, like a shockwave rippling through the assembled crowd. Glasses stopped moving. Breathing became irregular. The Chief of Staff's prepared statement died in his throat as he processed information that was reshaping everything he thought he understood about the evening's events. General Morrison's bourbon glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor in a cascade of crystal and liquid that seemed to echo through the stunned silence like gunshots. His mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged as his mind struggled to reconcile the medical corps uniform with credentials that existed at classification levels he had never been briefed to acknowledge. Director Crawford's face went through a rapid series of expressions as classified briefings from his highest security clearance levels began connecting with the figure standing calmly at the bar. Viper 1 was a legend whispered in intelligence circles, an operational ghost whose missions were compartmentalized beyond traditional oversight protocols, someone whose existence was denied at every level of government hierarchy. The Medical Corps uniform had been perfect operational cover, so convincing that it had fooled ultimate military and intelligence leadership for hours of systematic evaluation. Every assumption, every assessment, every conclusion about psychological incompatibility had been rendered meaningless by the revelation that they had been evaluating one of the most classified operators in American intelligence history. Admiral Patterson's hand trembled slightly as he set down his glass, understanding flooding through him like ice water as he realized that Viper 1 had been sitting quietly in their establishment while they conducted a comprehensive tribunal about medical personnel qualifications for special operations integration. The irony was staggering in its implications. Sergeant Major Rodriguez was the first to speak, his voice barely audible, but carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "Ma'am, forgive me. We had no idea." His apology contained the weight of professional recognition, the acknowledgement that every word spoken throughout the evening had been heard by someone whose operational authority exceeded their collective security clearance levels. Colonel Henderson's face had gone completely pale as classified briefings from his highest access levels began connecting with the reality of who had been observing their systematic evaluation. Viper 1's missions were legendary within intelligence communities, operations that shaped global security architecture under circumstances that required psychological conditioning beyond traditional special operations training. The Chief of Staff recovered first, his political instincts helping him process the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this evening has been quite educational. I believe we may need to reassess some of our assumptions about professional boundaries and operational integration protocols." His statement carried diplomatic weight, designed to minimize the political implications of having conducted a systematic evaluation of someone whose authority derived directly from executive oversight. Secretary Morrison stepped forward with movements that seemed suddenly uncertain, understanding that every conversation throughout the evening had been witnessed by someone whose operations were classified above his security clearance level. The Medical Corps uniform had provided perfect cover for operational observation that none of them had anticipated or detected despite their collective expertise in intelligence and security protocols. Dutch approached her position at the bar with obvious respect, his demeanor transformed from skeptical bartender to someone serving a legend whose existence was denied at every level of official documentation. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "anything you need is on the house. Forever." His offer carried the weight of professional recognition from someone who had served operators for decades without ever encountering someone of her classification level. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what resonated most with you, or share if you've witnessed similar situations where someone's true capabilities were revealed after being underestimated. Sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in plain sight, serving in ways we never imagined. The transformation was complete. Every operator, every representative of American special operations and intelligence capability stood in respectful silence as they processed the magnitude of their miscalculation. The evening had become a masterclass in operational security and cover identity maintenance, conducted by someone whose very existence represented the apex of classified operations and strategic capability that extended beyond their collective understanding of what was possible within the framework of American national security architecture.